Israel is intensifying its attacks in the Gaza Strip and ruling out a ceasefire. But at what cost? And where does the Palestine-Israel issue go from here? Let's get to the bottom line. Today we're talking with Miko Peled, a former Israeli soldier who now advocates for peace, and he's the author of The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. Miko, thank you so much for joining us today. There is widespread support across the Israeli political spectrum for current actions. You're a real standout. Tell us how you see things at this moment.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I want to start off by saying that there was no Hamas terror attack on October the 7th. Palestinian fighters came out of the Gaza Strip, one of the most oppressed and poor places on the face of the earth. And after decades and decades of suffering, violence and brutality, not to say savagery, at the hands of Israel, and in a cruel and unreasonable, needless siege on the Gaza Strip, they came out and they managed to almost take over the half of what is Israel today, and to paralyze the state of Israel for weeks. And so that is I believe a more accurate description of what took place. The state of Israel was caught off guard. The Israeli military has been once again shown to be nothing more than a paper tiger. And now, because like a gangster that's been humiliated, they're taking their vengeance on innocent civilians, killing thousands upon thousands of civilians, only for the sake of revenge. There's no strategy here. There's no real understanding of how to solve. There's no real intent to protect Israelis, so to speak, to provide safety. It's not a question of self-defense. It's a question of brutality and revenge, because Israel was humiliated and now they need to prove a point, so they're killing as many Palestinians as possible, which, by the way, has not stopped the Palestinian fighters from continuing to fight. And they entered with ground forces just a day or two ago, and they've already got close to 10 or 12 Israeli forces that have been killed.
Right, but Miko, I have to just jump in. I mean, I need to make clear I see it very, very differently than you, and this is an interview with you. But I also just want to say, in terms of framing, when I have been watching the Israeli-Palestinian relationship for a long time, I feel like the underlying tectonics have been wrapped in a whole series of grievances and injustices. It's very hard for me to hear someone say these are freedom fighters, given the horror of what we saw on October 7th.
There needs to be, this is part of a campaign to always paint the Palestinians as a wild, uncivilized mob that will behead children and rape white women. None of that is true. And many of the hundreds of Israelis that were killed were apparently now, according to Israeli testimony, according to testimony of Israelis who were on site, many of the Israelis who were killed by Israeli fire, by the Israeli military itself. So we don't really know how many were killed, if any, by the Palestinian fighters. But I want to point out here that when Israel drops tons of bombs on residential neighborhoods, what do you think happens to the children inside these homes? Are they not beheaded? Are they not, their little bodies destroyed? Do they not die from the gases and the fumes and the fire? And not to mention, yesterday we heard from Dr. Matz Gilbert that there are over 2,000 Palestinian children in Gaza missing. And you know what missing means? Missing that they're somewhere in the rubble and nobody can reach them. So that's even worse than the ones that have been killed. So the savagery here is not what we see on the Palestinian side. The stories of savagery that were perpetuated in the beginning were proven to be lies. We have seen a consistent policy of savagery and murder of civilians, not to mention beheading of children, if you want to talk about that. I don't want to get too descriptive here. What happens with the phosphorus and so on when it falls on the small bodies of children. And we've seen this going on for decades. The Israeli savagery didn't start on October the 7th. It's been going on for a very long time. So I think that, in my opinion at least, is a much more accurate description of what took place.
We can agree to disagree on that, but I am interested in a conversation that has begun to, show some sprouts in Washington, and it worries me a little bit. It's really about the day after. What does the future of Gaza look like? What does the future of Palestine look like? What has to be there? I've been asking, what about the day before this happened? Because this was largely an ignored conflict where people were not moving with ambition and purpose to figure out how the Palestinian-Israeli situation could lead to something credible and solvent when it came to peace and the rights of Palestinians. So, that was the day before. Let me ask you how you measure what the day after needs to look like in terms of after this conflict, given the fact that there was so much just shoving it under the rug the day before October 7th.
Yes, I think you're right. This is a historical moment right now, and I think this is an opportunity. With all the pain and the suffering and the horror that is taking place in Gaza, this is definitely an opportunity to grab the bull by the horns and to make real political demands, to fight for real political gains, or to achieve real political gains for the Palestinians once and for all, so that this does not happen again. If we're talking about tomorrow, we want to prevent this from happening again. And you're right, the fact that this was ignored and somehow people expected, Israelis particularly expected they can go on living like this while millions of Palestinians are being, living under these horrific conditions just a few kilometers away is not realistic. So what are we looking at? I believe it all depends on what kind of negotiations are going to take place. The problem is that the Palestinian issue is an orphan. There is no real Palestinian, there is no organization, there are no countries that are supporting the Palestinian cause for freedom and justice. And so what needs to happen now is there needs to be a demand, not just for a ceasefire. A ceasefire is going to happen when the sides decide to stop fighting. What needs to be demanded right now is an absolute immediate end to the siege on Gaza, an absolute unconditional release of all Palestinian political prisoners, and a demand for a one-person, one-vote elections over all of historic Palestine to create a real democratic state all over historic Palestine. Nothing less than this. The Palestinians have proven two things. Number one, they're absolutely capable of paralyzing the state of Israel. And once again, I'll say a handful of fighters from one of the poorest, most oppressed places in the world managed to paralyze the state of Israel completely for a very long time. And the second thing is the Palestinians are making enormous sacrifices once again. And so both of these things, I think, are deserving of serious attention, and nothing less than an absolute final political solution in Palestine is required at this point.
Now, the United States, Miko, is supporting Israel's military campaign for the moment, and it is also saying it will not call for the ceasefire, just as Prime Minister Netanyahu has said he will not engage in a ceasefire right now. And we are, in the United States, instead pushing humanitarian support. How do you see this U.S. role, and how do you see the humanitarian needs right now, and how they might be better achieved?
Well, once again, if you talk about the United States have been complicit in Israel's genocidal policies for a very long time. This is not new. They've been supporting it with arms and money and political cover. So this is nothing new, only that right now the attacks is so much more savage than it's ever been before. Again, I'll say what needs to be immediately demanded is an immediate, unconditional end to the siege on Gaza, and immediate support, humanitarian, medical support for the Palestinians in every way that is needed. And that means rebuilding hospitals. That means providing all the medical needs that are required, rebuilding homes, creating a reality that Palestinians in Gaza are able to live a normal life like free people anywhere else. 30 trucks or 20 trucks or 50 trucks or 100 trucks are not going to solve the problem. Palestinians, the world has turned Palestinians into beggars, and that's not to any fault of their own. They're turning Palestinians into refugees and into beggars. Palestinians need freedom. The conversation should be, how do we end this slaughter, this savagery by the state of Israel that's been going on for 75 years? Granted, there are ups and downs in the savagery, but this is, right? It's been savagery for 75 years, nothing less. How do we end it and demand and bring forward a real solution, a real just solution, so that Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace? And I'll say one more thing on the issue of peace. If we support the Palestinian call for justice and freedom, Israelis and Palestinians will be able to live in peace and raise their children and have a future. If we support Israel, or anyone who supports Israel, is actually supporting the fight against justice, the fight against peace.
So how do you actuate that in a credible way? Are there Israelis out there that believe what you believe, and how do you bring them along? When I look at Israeli politics, over the last 3 decades, particularly with Prime Minister Netanyahu, it has moved not left, but it's moved more and more right, including in the current government. So how do you take some of the ideas that you're sharing today and say, well, this is a very different formulation, but are there Israelis out there? Is there any credible path politically to what you're suggesting now?
Look, I don't think the whites in South Africa were particularly keen on ending apartheid. But then there were severe sanctions. There was a boycott against South Africa. There was serious divestment from South Africa eventually, and white apartheid South Africa was on its knees. That is precisely what needs to happen with Israelis. No privileged society, oppressive society, or oppressive regime has ever left willingly. They have to be forced out. And so, once again, what needs to be demanded is immediate sanctions against the state of Israel. Israeli diplomats, just like we've seen with Colombia, we've seen this now also, I believe, with a couple of other of the states in Latin America, and I'm sure this is going to be a trend. The diplomats, the Israeli missions are closing. The diplomats are being sent home. There should be, complete, boycott of Israeli teams in the Olympics and, in any sporting events, in any academic arenas, diplomatic arenas, and so on. The state of Israel, as we know, has been charged by Amnesty International has been accused of the crime of apartheid for 75 years. And as we know, the crime of apartheid is a crime against humanity. The Amnesty report has some important recommendations that include sanctions and include, diplomatic and political actions against the state of Israel. That will bring it to the point where they have no choice. I don't believe Israelis are going to do this willingly. They don't need to do this willingly. They need to be forced to allow for a real political solution, for real freedom and liberty. And again, understanding that at the end of the day, a just solution to the Palestinian for the Palestinian people will benefit Israelis as well, because again, it's not about Israelis versus Palestinians. It's Israel against peace. It's Israel against a just solution. It's Israel against freedom.
One of the questions I have is about the rage felt after a terror attack, and I know that you see it differently. But when I sort of saw 9/11 happen, and I saw the United States react, and Joe Biden said we overreacted. We acted in blind rage, and he encouraged Israel not to be blinded by the same kind of rage that, in America's case, led it down the wrong direction. And Israel, again, after what it saw as the horror on its borders along Gaza, 1,200 people dead. We now have around 200 people held hostage by Hamas. How do you, in this moment, if you were to advise government, if you had that opportunity, would you navigate this moment? Because there is just rage across Israeli society about what happened to them.
Well, this rage is completely unjustified. If anybody should be outrageous, it's the rest of the world. If there should be rage, there should be rage around the world against the treatment of Palestinians in Gaza, against the Palestinians who are held in Israeli prisons, against the fact that Palestinians are denied water, not only in Gaza, but throughout all of Palestine. It's the fact that Israel has been killing Palestinians in the West Bank wholesale through settlers and soldiers and so on. So, I mean, if there's any cause for rage, I believe the rage should be on the other side. And if we want to talk about terrorism, and again, I'll argue on that point once again, dropping a 1-ton bomb on a building and killing civilians is an act of terrorism. When out of 2 million people, a handful of fighters come out in order to take hostages, in order to bring about the release of political prisoners, I don't believe that is an act of terrorism. And regardless of how you frame it or what you call it, I don't know what kind of expectation people had that Palestinians will not engage in some form of armed resistance, being held, being treated the way they have been, being killed, and being, the horrors. I won't get into the horrors, but they've been going on for 75 years and they're well documented. To expect that Palestinians will not engage in some form of armed resistance is absolutely ludicrous. This is, and of course, according to international law, it's perfectly legitimate. If we're talking about acts of terrorism over the last 75 years, actually, I would talk about crimes against humanity, which are far worse. Israel has been engaged not only in terrorism, Israel has been engaged in crimes against humanity, specifically ethnic cleansing, specifically the the crime of apartheid, as has been, like I said, documented by the Amnesty International report, which for some reason people are very comfortably ignoring. And I will add it one step further and say Israel is actually being engaged in the crime of genocide, or at least genocidal policies, at least. So this is far worse than terrorism. And I think that, again, dropping a 1-ton bomb, not to mention hundreds of tons of bombs that Israel has been doing on a civilian population, and a particular population that has never had a military force. Palestinians have never had an army, they've never had a tank. So to claim that that is somehow self-defense is absurd. That is an act of terrorism. When people who are oppressed rise and stand up, even if they do so holding arms, that I reject completely the notion that that is somehow terrorism.
Let me ask you about the cast of characters that have long been involved in Israel-Palestine affairs. What about Turkey, China, other players in the world becoming part of that day after equation?
That's a great question. I mean, like I said earlier, Palestine is an orphan. The Palestinian issue is an orphan. And what happened over the last 3 or so decades, all these countries that were traditionally supportive of the Palestinian cause, the BRICS alliance, for example, most of the countries within the BRICS alliance and others are now all doing business with Israel. They're all doing trade with Israel. They're all buying weapons with Israel. You know, Africa, that was traditionally a continent that supported the Palestinian cause, are now, Israel has more than 40 diplomatic missions and is pushing to become a part, or at least an observer in the African Union, and they're being allowed to do this. And of course, that is a very serious problem. I think it's less important who the players are and more important what the content is. People need to understand, the world needs to understand, and I think we're seeing this now on the streets when we're seeing all these, massive protests in the streets and the calls for justice. The calls for justice are very clear. You can either have justice or you can have the state of Israel. The state of Israel, not Israeli people, the state of Israel needs to go. The state of Israel is an apartheid state. It needs to be replaced with a free, democratic state of Palestine, free democratic Palestine on all historic Palestine, one person, one vote elections. And we have, we've seen this happen. We have a roadmap. We've seen, fascist, dictatorial, and an apartheid regime in South Africa fall and be replaced by democratic governments, by democracies. So we've seen it happen many times before, and we need to follow the same roadmap. There's nothing that needs to be reinvented here. The issue is nobody is willing to stand up and say, the state of Israel is precisely the problem. It's not an occupation. It's not this. It's not the other. It's the state of Israel. It's an apartheid state. It is the obstacle to peace. It is the obstacle to justice. Now, as consumers of the media, as voters, we need to speak up and we need to make it clear to our elected officials, you cannot stand up and support Zionism because Zionism is racism. It's a racist ideology, and we demand no tolerance to racism. As consumers of the media, when we see a lot of, all the big names out there in the corporate media, idolizing Netanyahu, idolizing the state of Israel, we need to demand that they stop.
Right.
We need to demand that they stop. This is unacceptable to have an interview with Benjamin Netanyahu and not challenge him on the fact that he's murdering innocent civilians. All of his, rhetoric about it being 9/11 and another Holocaust is completely, mythical, not to say, an obscene lie. Right. I mean, it's really grotesque to hear what they're saying about what happened on October the 7th in terms of, their perspective as Israelis. The government of Israel failed to defend its own citizen. The state of Israel has been failing to defend all the people that it governs, which includes Israelis and Palestinians. And it's time for a different political perspective. It's time for a real free Palestine. It's time to dismantle the apartheid state and replace it with a free democratic Palestine.
Let me ask you a final question. I'm interested in what's happening in the United States and your perspective of it. I know you're in Jordan right now, but if you look at the broad cross-section of politics in America, Democrats on the whole and Republicans support Bibi Netanyahu, support Israel in this moment of crisis. But if you look at layer beneath that, Joe Biden's popularity has decreased 11 points among Democrats. You have protests around American colleges and universities that are basically supporting the Palestine cause. They sound a lot like you. From abroad, does America look different and less and more divided than you've seen in the past? Because you've been at this for a long time. But do you see greater division? Do you see a soul searching in the United States over these issues that you might not have seen before?
What I've been seeing in the United States and what I've been seeing in Europe, all over Europe actually, is something very interesting. There's a growing popular support for the cause of justice in Palestine and peace in Palestine and liberation for Palestinians. However, we see that the governments, like in the U.S., in the U.K., and throughout Europe, are all standing with Israel, and there's this massive gap between the popular support and the demand of the constituents and the elected officials. And somehow the demand for a free Palestine, the demand to stand with Palestine, is not being heard in the halls of power. And I see that as a failure of us as constituents, our failure as voters, that this important message is not getting through, that they're ignoring our calls, they're ignoring our demands, and going on with the support for Israel. And I think we need to regroup. Part of it is because, like I said, there's no parent, there's no organizational structure that supports the Palestinian cause, and there's no real state today that support the Palestinian cause. So we as citizens, we as constituents must make it clear to our elected officials that this will no longer stand. There will no longer be any tolerance for a politician who supports Israel.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Miko Peled, Israeli-American peace activist and author, thank you so much for being with us today.